Good morning. It's time to act. We're gathering our gang in the playground, and that's the single mom and the guy who's trying to support a wife and child. And we're trying to get you to chime in and gather our evidence. We want to know how much money you make and how much money it costs if you had a traditional household. Excuse me. How much money does it take to pay rent, or excuse me, to pay for a mortgage on a house and insurance and groceries and medical, and for that matter, a recreational budget for you. And you remember as uh, to have a summary that in the United States, where this is being where we are, we're in Tucson, Arizona. In the 1950s, the communists came out and said that there would be no religion, excuse me, that they would take over the United States by about the year 1973. They would take over the courts and the educational system and the entertainment industry. And sure enough, in the year 1973, that happened to be the year of the highest standard of living when it comes to the average Joe. And everything started to go down from there. In philosophy, what does it mean to talk about God and country? It means three things. It means straightening out our emotions, willing the good of another person, and they go together like two segments of a line that form the lowercase letter I, and that dot is Christ rising on the third day. You need you need that to uh, you, you need that to have everything make sense, and then you become an average Joe, and then you become a decent person, a good person. Then, if you choose to, you become a good wife and a good husband, and then a good mother. Motherhood is a profession, and then it spills into home economics, and take it from there. And that's what we're after. In courts, I'll remind you that courts came out in right about 1973, and they said that there would be no religion in government. And when they did that, the Bums Rush, the Twilight Zone horror moment, was to realize that when they did that, they threw out those three things that make up God and country. And it was an act of treason. One of us is committing treason. In fact, in philosophy, it's the stereotypical, straight out of a book definition of a satanic church. And what does it mean? It means they institutionalize hustling, and they institutionalize the idea of making money by causing other people to have to work more hours. In psychology, it was big at the time to say that they're going to uh, say that homosexuality is no longer a mental illness. They have something, the psychologists have something called the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, and it's something they argue about all the time. But they came out then and they said that homosexuality is a no longer, it's perfectly okay to be homosexual. And in doing so, the bum's rush was they threw out being normal and well adjusted. Both the Catholic and the atheist uh, define mental illness, they used to, as the normal taken into the abnormal, from a cold to the flu to pneumonia. The Catholics say, hold on, go backwards, go back to the normal, and normal is not good enough. For example, you sit in a chair and fantasize about the gals until you become sexually aroused, then do it again, only this time in your mind you're trying to get the gal pregnant. And there you go. For the young man to associate those very powerful thoughts in his head with actually getting the gal pregnant is not a natural thing at all. It's a very unnatural thing or original sin. You say the same thing about fear, and uh, you and your environment. Your environment changes your attitude, and then you have to be taught that. So that famous phrase, "What takes away your free will? Fear, sex, ignorance, and violence," kicks in. And then there's a little more to that. You have to have some outside imposed thing, and that's the Catholic Church. That's the idea of Christ rising on the third day. If you hold that as faith, then you can act reasonably and you can act very decently. Those two famous philosophical arguments, and it spills into society. It's called home economics. So let's see. In courts they threw that out. In philosophy they threw that out. Uh, in the political, they certainly threw that out. And in economics, they threw out home economics. Home economics is what you need to get, what we need to get you back into. That's when the married couple is viewed as a base economic unit. Go up to go up to the computer you're listening to this on, pretend to take out a transistor, take out a second transistor, and as you take out the third one, it's no longer a computer, it's a pile of electronic parts. Put that back in, and it's back to being a computer, and that's the family as a base economic unit. Home economics is the opposite of poverty. Poverty is when it doesn't make, you can't make your basic needs, and you start to suffer, you go hungry, and that sort of thing. The opposite of that, pulling you into a world of plenty where everything's comfortable, is called home economics. And the 10-year-old can't pay for his mommy. Mommy can't take care of the 10-year-old and go out and work in the factory. And the dad can't go out and work in the factory and stay home and take care of the kids. But if the two come together and they're viewed as a single unit, everything starts to make sense. And that's true as emotionally, and that's true as you enter into the world. So picture that, a detached house from the 1950s that's very intentionally designed for this sort of thing. You can design a house where a married couple will be divorced in 6 months. You can design a house where a married couple will live happily ever after. There are rules that govern that, and those rules are long since thrown out as the way they make houses today. So go back to a 1950s American house that was intentionally designed for that, a post-World War II house. Then picture it. Now go off to the side and start with farming and mining. Then above that, manufacturing. Then above that, wholesale, retail, and repair. Then above that, retirement, education, and recreation. And then our doctors and lawyers form a kind of lattice that holds it all together. And it's the Catholic priest that causes everything to come into being to begin with. And there you go. Then you have home economics. Ask the gal how many oranges she wants to use. Now you know how many orange trees to plant in order to give everybody into a world of plenty. I picture a world where that couple in that house is choosing between a couch and 2 recliner chairs, and you can just see all of the crops for the materials and mining, and then the manufacturing, whether it's a couch or a chair, and then the stores and the advertising, everything's geared towards getting that young couple what they want. And the kicker is the same people that do the producing have to do the consuming, and you will the good of another person. You're trying to make that person better off. You arrange parameters of competition. If you arrange the parameters of competition so that there's a large middle class, there'll be a large middle class. If you breed a breed of normal, well-adjusted people, there'll be a breed of normal, well-adjusted people. And the idea of the environment, the parameters of competition kick in, and it ends up a religious thing. And just so you have a choice, if Christ rose on the third day, and there's that infusion in your mind, and then, well, you walk down this road, and it has its benefits. You simply choose it. Just to say the words out loud, if there is no God, if Christ didn't rise on the third day, then other rules kick in. And to be candidly honest, that's what the famous of the famous, the Aristotle and Plato and those guys say, to the highest standard of living you can have in this world is to be a psychopathic nut living in the foothills. You do all the consuming and everybody else lives in the valley and they do all the producing. And that's just been the way it is for the history of human beings on this earth. The United States was a very much a minor an exception to the rule, and they had everything going. The post-World War II United States was doing everything so very right, and they threw it all out. You are living in that. They had reached a crossroads in that culminated in the 1970s, and then it fell apart. They had a choice to cash in on it all, and they simply took advantage of it, and they did that. Who did that? Well, Harry the hippie and Al the Afro and Donna the feminist, the people who were terribly malicious. And there was a solid connection between money and malice. And the more malicious they are, the better off they became. And that's kind of that. If you were a gal and you went back to ask the 10-year-old what he wanted for his birthday, you paid dearly for it. You were plunged into poverty. It's called the lazy V, and it looks something like this. They got into gold and real estate, and they got into a duplex and started renting property out to other people, and it just gets worse and worse. Now there's a very distinct peasant and property class society. It could have looked this way. Excuse me for talking with my hands. You draw a line straight across, and that's home economics. They take the leadership style of washing the feet of the apostles, and a phrase we snitched from EWTN. And the Catholic priest maximizes benefits and maximizes utilities in a completely different manner. And so because of that, you arrange things so that the guy who puts you in your own business makes more money than the guy who owns lots of stores, and the guy who owns everything, and you have to rent from him and work from him. Well, he's out of the picture. He's the bad guy. And now it's the reverse. You're paying a terrible price for that over and over again. You can go on the computers. I make my take-home pay is about $1,000 a month, and I have to pay $1,600 in rent, and I only have $400 to do everything else. What am I doing? I'm trying to work a job or two jobs just to put my child in daycare center so I can watch somebody else raise my child. And they're past the point of tears. The Catholic nun, this traditional house where you're a housewife, by the way, is a profession. It's one of those hustling things they used decades ago. You spent your life raising your kid, and that was your identity, and that's nonsense. You have the identity. Susie in St. Louis has the identity of Susie, and she's a normal, well-adjusted person, and her value is herself. She, the last of the 1950s home economists, they're the ones that are worth their weight in gold. Compare them with the feminists that are in charge of so many of the government agencies and that sort of thing here today, and it's just silly. It's the common house. It's the American Yank, the 1950s home economists that were so valuable, and it's the nun that causes all them to come into being. If you want to have fun, go in the computer and type in vocational stories of Catholic nuns, and they're still out there, but I don't know why, how they made it. And you'll see a noticeable difference, just a snap of the finger difference between them and the feminists you see on TV and running the government agencies and the universities here. Those nuns in this camp are called the good guys, and you're called the good guy if you subscribe to that. And so we've got to hear from you. If you'll call in and say, okay, look, I found some old books on home economics, and this is the budget I need. This is how to raise children, the scientific method. This is, I need a living room with that's maybe 12 by 20 feet, and a bedroom and a dining room and a kitchen to support the dining room. That's how you get a detached house and a backyard. How much is a mortgage for a house? How much money do you have to make? You have 2 children. There are 2 teenage children. And how in the world do you do it? And the answer is you don't. You're either in the upper class, and chances are your parents or grandparents got into gold and real estate, and you're collecting rent from other people, or you're in dire straits. They'll keep it up until it collapses. And so it's up to you. You just have to hear this, or find somebody if you're listening to this, and go grab them and get them over here. This is how much money I need for food. This is how much money I need to get everybody out of poverty. They used to talk about recreation time. There was a time when they had discussions on television about what to do with all the recreation time. They don't do that anymore. if you're going to do this, and we sincerely hope you do, you include recreation time. There was you can compare that with tennis. Tennis was popular to be used for the women's liberation movement and Billie Jean King and all that. And now go back and take a second look at that. There were gals who, so many of them took so many male steroids, they became lesbians. They used cigarettes as a sponsorship. Uh, uh, there was this thing about beating one of the professional male players, and they made such a big deal out of it until you went back and realized that he was a hotshot player of about 20 years before that. He was just a guy who liked publicity, and he had won one match, even though he was so much older than with one of the most famous tennis players, and then he lost the other match, and they say it had more to do with gambling debts than anything else, but it didn't make one bit of difference. It was all emotion. And so the amateur, they made a big deal about professional tennis or amateur tennis, excuse me. And so the gal who was the home economist, the gal who got the kids raised and did volunteer work and did that sort of thing. And when the kids were in school and it was her time to drop the kids off at school and change the radio to that very endearing country club music and head off for the country club and play tennis with the gals and get a massage by some guy named Bjorg and that sort of thing, they threw that out. They threw one world out in favor of the other. If you were a gal and you went and you had virtues and you went back and asked the 10-year-old what he wanted for his birthday, you got plunged into poverty. And it didn't make any difference, just so it said. If you were a Latino gal or a white gal or a black gal that ended up in housing projects, or or any way you want to look at it, it didn't make any difference. If you take a step back and arrange things along the lines of the classic battle of good and evil, then you realize that it didn't make any difference whether it was Harry the hippie or Al the Afro or Donna the feminist. The Republican and Democrat really wasn't thought of that much at that time. It was all hustling. It was all cashing in on it. And they did an awfully good job. And so we're going to end this now. We've been doing this a couple of times, trying to get people to pass the word and chime in. We know exactly what's wrong. They threw out God and country. They said they'd do it, and they did it. And they said they would push us into a consumption society. They did that. And now we're paying a dear price for it, and we're in dire straits if we don't do something. What do we do, by the way? What's wrong? What do you do about it? And how do you do it? What's wrong? They threw out God and country, the very thing that made the United States its identity. What do you do about it? Well, instead of courts coming out and saying there is no God, you start with courts and society coming out saying there's only God, or the Apostles' Creed. If I choose to put the Pope in charge, and the Pope holds the moral high ground. So if I put the Pope in charge, suddenly I'm my own man and I'm part of a well-oiled group. If somebody walks up to you and says, you be your own man, you do your own thing, and I find myself living in the slave quarters and those guys are living in the big house, and there's that emotional change, that sense of original sin, it really messes a fella up, and you've got to publicize that. That's the first stage. Been in these shoes before, tried this before. It's a 4-stage process. That's the first stage, to publicize a sense of original sin so that you have an idea of what's going on. And then we're in the United States. Within the boundaries of the United States, it's a 3-step process. First, you go to government, and I'm sure those people in the Supreme Court will say they're very sorry and get out of there and go get a garbage sack and start forming a class of peasantry beneath the class of poverty that they caused. I don't think they'll do that, but that's what they should. Let me remind myself, one of us is committing treason around here. It isn't us. So you're going to have to face that emotional wave of violence. In other words, there's a priest and there's a pimp, and you're going to have to stand up to a pimp. And pimps hustle, and they have rules, and you're just going to have to man up and face them. Then phases 2, by the way, you go between Tucson and Tombstone, you pretend there's a ladder, you take that ladder and turn it, that's upside down, you take that ladder and turn it right side up. Here in Tucson, where this is being filmed, guys would come in and they'd buy 1,000 houses and turn them into rental property. So I'm sure they'll give up those houses, and I'm sure they'll go form a class of peasantry. And then you take those houses, you put them up for sale, and then you sell them to our gang, the home economists. The gal we need to start chiming in. You don't pay rent to other people. 10-year-olds can't pay you. You're going to have to be a normal, well-adjusted person with a sense of caring, and society is just going to have to come across with a family budget, and that's that. Probably an extra kid or two, and that's that. You get to go play in that silly tennis tournament they have. And phase 3, you build. You picture a house, and then you go off to the side and follow the rules, farming and mining and manufacturing and that sort of thing. And then you get started. You Darwinize to heaven. And you keep it up until you can get onto a maintenance level. Till there's a chicken in every pot and a car in every garage was a famous expression. Here in Tucson, you could just see it. You would, if it's true that courts came out and said there is no God and they changed things, they might as well have come in with tanks. And as a matter of fact, they did throw bombs in the streets. They did tear it all down. They would have torn it all down if they hadn't won. And they did win. And so you would get a bunch of guys together. You would stand down, grab your 3-cornered hat and 5-inch drum, go over to the courts. And I'm sure the judges would get out of there in a big hurry. But then instead of taking over the place, you go and find some poor slob of a criminal trial attorney that chose to make so much less money by defending the poor and the oppressed as a real estate attorney or a tax attorney. And then you grab him and you sort of slap him around. Then you stick him in charge. I have the good kind of dependent personality. I insist that person lives in a doctor's and lawyer's neighborhood. He'll never be living in the foothills collecting rent, but he'll be at the top of society. He'll be living in a doctor and lawyer's neighborhood. I insist he takes Wednesdays off, and I insist he plays in that silly tennis tournament they have every year, whether he likes it or not. It's a very unnatural thing. It goes against Mother Nature. I fight for that sort of thing. And then it heads out in society. We have home economics, and we start to have the fruits of it all. A huge middle class. Kids have shoes on their feet, and people start to talk about recreational time. It'll all come down to you. And also, I always forget to mention the guys. And if you're a guy and you're driving a forklift in a warehouse, you ask yourself, how much money do you make? Can you support a wife and children? If you can't, then, well, don't have sex and don't get married. And if you can't and want to support a wife and kids, then you better start speaking up. In Phoenix, it takes somewhere between $175,000 to $200,000 just to get into a small house. And I think I'm told that's the kind of the cheapest you're going to get. If you go to some of the other cities, you have to make a lot more than that just to get into a house, no less support a wife and child. Is that you? How much money do you make driving a forklift? If that's not you, then you better speak up. What you say is not how much money I make, but rather how many hours do I have to work in order to. And the guy and gal becomes one person, but you sort of split them apart so you can get the thought out. And if you're a gal, try and figure out how much of a mortgage is, how much does a family budget is. You have a sense of turning a house into a home. You run it as a business, so to speak. And then you turn to the guy and you ask how many hours you have to work in order to do that. Chances are good, right now you're living in apartments or renting, or you're living in a housing project. And those people in the foothills, well, whether they're called slumlords or the communist intelligentsia, couldn't care less. Let's go back over here. If you see the house behind me, this is a house I grew up in. It was built right around 1950, the post-World War II house. And it was a stereotypical house intended for the average Joe to live in. This is actually called a blue collar neighborhood, or used to be. And our dad was a repairman. A couple doors down was a milkman, if you know what that is. Next door is a plumber. Up the road is a school teacher, a guy who worked in a hay store selling a feed store selling hay and grain, and the whole neighborhood was like that. In other words, the same people who did the producing did the consuming. The same thing, people who built the houses lived in the house. And as a matter of fact, this house was built by one guy. There was one guy who obviously built two houses around here. And one guy built one house, another guy built another house. The person who built this neighborhood, his son, Deacon Cheney, was a famous senator for decades. He built this neighborhood, and you can describe it as if you take your hand and you push it away. And that's a terrific example of the very best of society, the idea of an American Yank. And you could just see a slum being built. It all fell apart. And you never saw homeless people. You see them now. You can go out the back door and you can see people, apartments that are called houses, quote unquote. They actually tried to fight this. Some homeowners association here went down and tried to fight that for this neighborhood, and couldn't do anything about it. There's just nothing you can do about it. Nobody wants it, except, and nobody can do anything about it, even though we're here in the United States, and even though they were so conniving about it. That has to change. And you have to go. What happens is you go all the way up to the Supreme Court and you say, enough of this. You guys threw out our society. They threw out home economics. They threw out the idea of willing the good of another person and everything. And that ends it all. And we're just living the fruits of it. So you've got to speak up. If you're a gal and you're trying to come up with enough money to support a child and get, or perhaps a teenager, and they're in dire straits, you know what happens when a teenager sees his mom working and he tries to grow up too fast, he ends up in the county jail, and that's exactly what happens. So you have to stop and regroup. If you'll come together here and you start collecting information. I live in Los Angeles. I live in St. Louis. I live in London. This is how much money I make, and this is what I need. And then you can go back. You can draw a line back. Once you do that, you can do something about it. Here in the United States, it was just a given. Just because they snuck it in and threw it out didn't make it legal. I'm for the violent overthrow of the United States government, says Angela Davis, who's during the last rioting was a university professor from the 60s. She's still around, and when they had all the riots here, there she is putting her fist in the air and getting $30,000 a speech for it, if I got the story right. And Jane Fonda, if people just cry communism, she says during the Vietnam War, sitting on an artillery piece, standing up against for the communist North Vietnam and against our troops, and no one shot her. No one arrested her and executed her for treason. If we hadn't done, if they hadn't given us everything we wanted, we would have. Tore it all down, said Donna Shalala, the first Black Surgeon General female of the United States. They got everything they wanted, you guys. So if you're living in housing projects and it's just a world of hell, or you're living in a slum trying to come up with rent money, they're called slumlords. They're not called slumlords for nothing. If you're a guy and you just can't make ends meet, well, it's up to you. You're going to have to speak up. So pass the word, please. We'll try. We have a Facebook channel and an Instagram channel, Time to Act, and hope you go on there and publicize it. And we hope you'll pass the word and start chiming in here. I live in Tollesbury, England. This is how much money I make. And if you can, this is how much of a budget I need. You don't rent property. You own it. Don't rent property to people. Don't rent property from people. So maybe you can stop and uh, if and look at a house that's for sale and see if it's the kind of house that you can actually raise a family in. They're not built that way anymore, but you find one. Then find out how much the mortgage is. Call in and tell us about it. How much is the average budget? How much is this and that? By the way, we also have this podcast, and I'll try and be on at 12 o'clock. Well, excuse me, at 11 o'clock Los Angeles time. I guess 2 o'clock New York time on Saturdays and Mondays, and let's see, 11 o'clock New York time on Sundays, and so we can start getting our time together and call in. This is coming from Tucson, so this is 12 o'clock Tucson time, and at 9 o'clock in the morning on Sundays in Tucson time. But I have a problem, and the problem is I do a lot of babysitting, and sometimes I don't really know when, so I have to change the hours. I certainly don't mind babysitting a bit, but I certainly mind the reasons I have to babysit. And that's because they can't afford $700 or $800 a month to have somebody else raise a child and pick them up and take them home. You just can't do it, and they're not going to do it. And you better do something about that in a big hurry. And from the guy's point of view, well, chances are you're trying to raise other people's children. And if they're starting to look at you and call you daddy, boy, you better start speaking up. You're going to make enough money to support a wife and child. You're going to make enough money to own your own house. All that idea of reparation stuff is a lot of hustling and nonsense. On this camp, you're going to have a very serious sense of reparations. And we'll take that very seriously. And so you've got to start speaking up, Solers, to it. So I hope to see you tomorrow. That's Sunday. That would be about 8 o'clock Los Angeles time, 11 o'clock New York time, and about 4 o'clock London time. I hope to see you there.